All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the Ice Cream for PR's podcast. My name is Jeff Nippard, and I am your host, and I'm going to get into an interview or a conversation that I had with Kamal Patel of Examine.com in just a minute. But first, I want to just make the announcement that this podcast is going to be undergoing a name change. So for the last, I would say probably the last year, I've been thinking about whether I want to keep going with the Ice Cream for PR's podcast and have it more of a laid-back format where I talk about my diet and training and my own experiences with competing. And that was the way that Robin and I sort of did it for the first year or so of the podcast. And that was great, and I do want to continue to incorporate aspects of that into the show. But more so what I've become more passionate about and where I feel the podcast is best able to serve the greatest number of people who are interested in this sort of content is by focusing on having expert nutritionists, expert coaches, researchers, and elite level athletes come on the show and ask difficult questions and really be at the cutting edge of what it is that's going on in the nutrition and training community, and sort of dig a layer deeper and really have a science-based approach to the show, but also incorporate in my own experiences with training and my own sort of skeptical nature to everything. And I feel as though the name Ice Cream for PRs doesn't really capture that, and so I've decided to make a switch. So if you guys want to contribute to that decision, the best thing to do would be to tweet at me. So my Twitter handle is @JeffNippard. So you can tweet me. Make sure to hashtag Ice Cream for PRs, spelled with a 4, number 4, and then PRs, just so that you can make sure that I see it. So if you have any ideas, let me know. There are a few that I'm working on myself. So I have a top 3 top 3 candidates, if you will. So the first one is just the Jeff Nippard Show, and this is really just an obvious one. But whenever I have guests on and they share the interview or what have you, they always just say I was on Jeff Nippard's podcast. They don't usually say the Ice Cream for PR's podcast, and I feel as though that name doesn't reflect, like I said, what it is that I do here. And so the podcast is really my creation and not its own entity, if that makes sense. So the Jeff Nippard Show is one. Another one is the Rationally Fit podcast. I really like this one because I think that rather than just being a science-based show, I think that this podcast is really all about reason and rationality and skepticism and asking questions. And I think that we could call it like the Scientifically Fit podcast. But I think that if we limit our scope to only that which is scientific, we miss out on some important questions. And so I think that rationality really sort of captures everything that I'm trying to do here. And I think that fit, more so than PRs, sort of encompasses everything that I'm doing. So people who just want to, get in good shape or improve their health can benefit from this as well. And then option number 3 would be Fitness Science Radio with Jeff Nippard. So I already said in the last one that most of what I do here is science-based. But if it were me choosing, I would probably favor the Rationally Fit podcast with Jeff Nippard over Fitness Science Radio with Jeff Nippard, just because I think that what I do here is more than just science. And there are a number of other science-based shows that sort of do a really good job of covering that ground. But nonetheless, that is one that I think does kind of have a little bit of a ring to it or whatever. So I wanted to include that as a third option. So just to recap, there's the Jeff Nippard Show, Rationally Fit podcast, and Fitness Science Radio with Jeff Nippard. So let me know what you think, guys. I'll also be posting about this on my personal Facebook page. So if you just search Jeff Nippard, you can add me as a friend there still, and you can comment on that. And so without any further ado, I'll get right to my conversation with Kamal Patel. This was one of the most enjoyable conversations that I've had on this show to date. Kamal is a really, really intelligent guy, really sharp guy, very familiar with the research, and he has some very interesting views that don't necessarily align with the way I see a lot of things, and I think that that'll come out in the conversation. But I think it's really cool to see that we can still have a productive discussion about a lot of these sort of controversial topics. And I think that you guys are really going to enjoy this one. All right, so I give you Kamal Patel. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Ice Cream for PR's podcast. My name is Jeff Nippard, and I am your host. And joining me this week, I've got Kamal Patel of Examine.com, and we're going to be talking about a whole bunch of science-driven stuff, from some popular nutrition myths and some catchy news headlines to the fundamentals of supplementation for bodybuilding. But before I get into that, I just want to give you guys a quick reminder of where you can find this podcast. So first of all, you can listen to it on iTunes and Stitcher. And the video and the audio recording can be found on my YouTube channel. So that would be found at youtube.com/Jeff Nippard. And if you're not subscribed there already, I would recommend doing so so that you don't miss future episodes. I do have a number of roundtables and debates lined up for April and May. So you want to make sure you subscribe and turn your notifications on so that you don't miss those. The other little bookkeeping item is that if you guys want to support this podcast in any way, if you like the content that I'm putting out here, given that the Ice Cream for PR's podcast is unfunded, the best way that you can do that is simply by going to iTunes and leaving me a rating or a review. So if you like the podcast, head over to iTunes and let me know how you feel about it over there. And if you're watching this on YouTube, then you can feel free to leave me any comments in the comments section. Or feel free to share the podcast if you think that others might benefit from it. So on to this week's guest. Kamal is the director at Examine.com. And if any of you guys aren't familiar with Examine.com, this is probably one of the other main resources that I recommend to people for science-based information on nutrition and supplementation. Last week I had Lyle McDonald on the podcast, and I really bragged up his website, bodyrecomposition.com. And I said it's probably one of the 2 or 3 resources that I recommend pretty much weekly to people. And I would say that Examine.com is probably the other one, along with Alan Aragon's research review. Those would probably be my top 3 resources if you're going to have only 3 places to go for science-based information on nutrition, training, and supplementation. Those would probably be my top 3. So it's a real pleasure to have Kamal on the show today. A little bit more background on him. He is a nutrition researcher with an MPH and an MBA from John Hopkins University. He's currently on hiatus from a PhD in nutrition, covering the link between diet and chronic pain. He's published peer-reviewed articles on vitamin D and calcium, as well as a variety of clinical research topics. He's also been heavily involved in research on fructose and liver health, mindfulness meditation, and nutrition in low-income areas. So Kamal, it's a real pleasure to have you on the show, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jeff.
All right, man. So basically what I want to do here is first touch on some of the big news, attention-grabbing headlines that you see. Typically things to do with, red meat, aspartame, sweeteners, this sort of stuff, and really delve into the science behind all of that. Maybe bust a few nutrition myths along the way. And then after that, I'd sort of like to transition into supplementation, since I know that's a lot of what you guys do at Examine.com.
Sure.
So why don't we start with processed meat? That's been a pretty hot topic of late. And as you probably know, the World Health Organization put out that statement covering the risk of processed meat, and it caused quite a bit of a buzz in the mainstream media. So I guess I'll just ask you the question: does processed meat cause cancer, and is it otherwise bad for you?
So it probably depends on what type of processed meat the meat is. So usually when people talk about does something cause cancer, then the main consideration is the dose. But here, one of the main considerations that doesn't come up is what is the meat? Because people don't say, do plants cause cancer, or are plants good for mental health? So similarly, red meat is a huge category. Even processed red meat is a huge category. So processing in and of itself could be, grinding meat to make a hamburger, and that doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means that it's easier to eat. Um, and starting from thousands of years ago, humans had to process meat in order to keep it fresh, or else it would go bad. So looking at the types of processed meats that are available now, like in the supermarket, um, going through the main ones, I'd say, the one that I probably like best is hot dogs. I I don't know what it is about hot dogs. Even it doesn't matter if it's like the organic pastured kind or the fake meat kind, they all taste good. It might be the salt content, but people try to pick apart what is it about a hot dog that might be unhealthy. So first of all, we don't even really know if hot dogs are unhealthy, because when researchers do studies, they don't do randomized trials of eating 3 hot dogs a day versus eating 3 placebo hot dogs a day for 12 months, because you can't do that. And even if you could, it would have to be more than 12 months, because cancer isn't a dichotomous outcome. It isn't that either you get cancer or you don't get cancer. It's that it's a process, and cells start going a bit crazy, and then eventually, when you have enough of them and they draw enough blood supply and get enough fuel, then they can become malignant. So with something like a hot dog, it might be that um, maybe you're just eating a lot of meats in general, and that's taking the place of other foods that could be healthy. It could be the actual processing. Maybe that there's nitrates added, which doesn't really have a huge strong connection to cancer, but it could. But then it appears that other things that dietary things that increase nitrates don't cause cancer. Like certain green vegetables are not cancer causing. But it's because the processed meats tend to be subject to heat. And then that makes it so that those meats can produce things like N-nitrosyl compounds, which are metabolites of nitrates. And then also things like heterocyclic amines if you grill meats. So it's really not processing per se that's bad. It's usually the high heat, maybe some additives, and also that the meat is taking the place of other things that might be healthier. And it's definitely not all cancer. It's generally colorectal cancer. And the reason for that is that the digestive system is things that stem from the tube going from your mouth out your butt, and that tube is susceptible to foods, much more so than, for example, your brain would be, because in order to get to the brain, foods have to go through first pass metabolism through the liver. They have to be distributed, and then they have to go through a blood-brain barrier. So things like digestive cancers and maybe even liver cancers or pancreatic cancers, those things might be a bit more susceptible to diet than things like brain. But it's basically those things that I mentioned that might be the mechanism. In addition to, if you eat a lot of meat, you get a lot of protein. Protein isn't inherently bad, but one of the few things that in animal studies and worm studies can reliably increase lifespan is reducing protein intake and calorie restriction. So it's a very tenuous link to humans, but it is one possible thing. And another thing is a lot of iron. So processed meats, because they're meat, have iron, and too much iron can mean a high oxidant load on the body. So nobody really knows what it is that causes the potential link, but it hasn't been explored in randomized trials because that's not possible. But there is a fairly strong link in observational studies.
Just to quickly touch on the potential protein-related mechanism there, do you think that that's a viable mechanism? I mean, considering the fact that increasing protein intake has been linked to a ton of positive health outcomes in the literature, that seems like it might be a bit of a stretch to me. I mean, it might be something going on there in worms or whatever the animals models are that they're using that may not apply in humans.
Yeah, so out of animal trials, probably rodents are the one that apply to us more, and worms apply to us less. Worms are the only ones, or one of the only ones that you can do these studies with because there's a lot of them. You can kill them. They have a quick life cycle. That being said, I don't think high protein intake is harmful, 99%. But I do think people who err on the side of a higher than high protein intake just to be safe, I don't think that's a great idea. Like adhering to the protein recommendations from the websites you said, like Lyle's Protein Bible is a great book. Alan Aragon always has good recommendations for protein, and as do we. And Stu Phillips every year comes out with a new paper on what the specific optimal level is for athletes. But looking at it from a broader perspective, humans didn't have generally a steady protein source every day for their entire lives. So, when I first started lifting weights, I was a sophomore in college, and because I had a high protein intake and learned about nutrition quickly, I figured out that what I did in the kitchen was much more important than in the gym. And I went up right away to, I don't know, it was probably about 2 grams per pound of lean body mass. But, I had that intake for years, maybe a decade or more. But now that I'm a little bit older, I start to think more in terms of the precautionary principle that the burden of evidence is on us if we want to do things that haven't been done by humans before. And our great grandparents are very unlikely to have had protein intakes of 2 grams per pound every day for 10 years. Why is that bad? Well, it's not. It's not necessarily bad. We don't really know if it's bad for anything. But, for example, tumors, the sort of like alternative medicine viewpoint is watch out when you eat carbs because we've known since Otto Warburg in the 1920s that tumors feed on glucose, on sugar. Well, that's kind of outdated and not true. Tumors can feed on anything. You can't starve tumors, but tumors need amino acids too. And there's really no knowing if a really high protein intake over a really long time might be carcinogenic in ways we don't know, which sounds really alarmist because the takeaway is we don't know. But like in the gut, for example, we're just starting to learn what different bacteria can eat and which different types of bacteria are good and bad, or good in certain situations and bad in others. So I'd say, like, unless you're a professional bodybuilder, you're trying to support an unnaturally huge mass, and you're also taking, other things that might legally or illegally boost your mass. Try to stay at the top intake of protein and maybe occasionally go lower than that rather than taking a huge protein intake over the course of years.
And like as a just ballpark figure there, like what would you consider to be excessive in this case? I mean, based on the literature that we have.
So I don't remember what it was that Ronnie Coleman had. It was maybe 3 grams per pound.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, something like
That's definitely excessive,
800
and
grams a day or something. Yeah.
I love Ronnie Coleman. I don't know him, and I don't literally love him, but like those guys are, when you see them in their 50s, it's sad. I think there was a video going around of him, in his wheelchair now, and it's not because he ate a lot of protein. It's because of the taxing compound lifts over time. But I don't think he ate a lot of vegetables, and vegetables aren't a cure-all, but it was like a lot of meat, a lot of brown rice or whatever. 3 grams per pound of protein definitely, or per pound of lean body mass is too high. I would say variation might be more important than the absolute level. Bodybuilders are really great at sticking to good habits and maintaining those habits in order to perform well in competition. But, if you have your mainstay breakfast of 4 egg white omelet, a snack of protein bar, shake, and then whatever, then that's great. But don't feel the need to do that literally every day for years, because it's the toxicologists always look at things in terms of the accumulated dose over time. And it's not at all bad to have a high protein intake or a high intake of maltodextrin and dextrose post-workout. But it might be bad to do that over the course of 10 years because nobody's going to do a study over 10 years. So we just don't know. We don't know what the effects would be.
But couldn't you just say that about anything? Like you could be like eating juicy fruit gum over 10 years could be bad for you just because we're not going to do that study. Like if we have no other reason to suppose that a higher protein intake is going to have negative health effects, then we could just Occam's razor say, you know what, it's probably safe and it's probably okay within reason to elevate your protein intake.
So that's actually a good example because something like juicy fruit could be bad over the course of 10 years, but it's always looking at the dose. So protein is called protein because, the prefix pro means important or something in Greek. So protein is super important both to get enough and as sources for building blocks for everything in the body. And because I can only know a lot about very specific areas, like I know a decent amount about supplementation, I know a fairly good amount about nutrition and chronic pain. I have a friend who started a biotech company in Boston the past year who used to be in nutrition, but now this biotech is based off his wife's cancer lab that's looking at angiogenesis and feeding tumors. Um, and I only know like less than an abstract's worth about that. But like that guy, for example, he eats a moderately high protein intake, but he's fairly careful about the things he eats. So, like, even over the course of a year or so, I don't think it's at all bad to eat high protein every single day. But because, the things we get a lot of in our body are protein, carb, fat, water, pretty much, right? So, like you were sort of hinting at before, aspartame is not something we get a ton of. So, that's not something that the precautionary principle would apply to as much because even in really high doses in rodents, it's not that bad. But protein is something we get a lot of. Carbs are something we get a lot of. So it's not even that eating high amounts, like 2 grams per pound, is bad. It's going over that for long periods I would be wary of. And I can't even claim to know exactly why. It's just, like for myself, I have a higher threshold for evidence than for other people. And probably everybody should be like that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I guess what I want to do is just clarify because there's been also a lot of hatred against protein in mainstream media in terms of renal function and skeletal health. And these have been shown in the literature, I think, all but conclusively that it's probably safe within the limits we've been talking about, like say up to 2 grams per pound or what have you. Are you still skeptical about protein for that reason, or is it more so just the fact that it's unknown what its effects will be over time?
Yeah, definitely not any of the mainstream media concerns because there's a greater abundance of evidence for the safety of higher protein intakes for liver, kidney, and other stuff than for pretty much anything else. Protein is safe. Protein is one of the main things we eat that's part of meat and some plants. So it's definitely not bad for that. It's more so that it's really stemming from things like gut microbiome research. There's so many new things and things that we don't know each year that like I want to feed my microbiome roughly what it might have been fed before, plus or minus 2 standard deviations or something. So like for myself, for example, things I wonder about are my family is originally from an area that had many more vegetarians than almost any part of the world, Western India. So it's very different than most European countries. Definitely, like Inuit who eat a lot of meat. And then for years I was like, well, it doesn't really matter because you'd only have to go back 400 or 500 years to go to a time when my ancestors or recent ancestors did eat meat. And then for religious or other purposes or scarcity of food, they started not eating meat. But then I started wondering, do I have different like iron metabolism than other people because my parents and grandparents and their parents ate less meat. And I haven't found anything about that. But just, 2 days ago, there was a study that came out, which is fairly groundbreaking, that something like 80% of people in a Western Indian city had a mutation in a gene or an allele that made it so that they produce more long chain polyunsaturated fatty acids than do other people. Whereas Americans and Europeans had about 20% of people like that. And then the end result was that we probably produce more arachidonic acid than white people essentially do. And that could be the media made it out to be that vegetarian diets are harmful, which obviously they're not because it's not my diet that produced that. It's my ancestors' diet that produced that genetic change that survived into me. So I haven't read the full text of the paper, so I can't claim to know what it says specifically, but it's interesting because who would have thought before that because my skin is darker and I'm Indian, that for whatever reason, maybe gut bacteria metabolize things differently, or maybe producing more arachidonic acid and potentially more EPA and DHA made it so that children who are weaning had greater probability of surviving. Maybe because people are poor in that part of India or something. So there's just so much stuff that we don't know. And even within, like, Europeans are taken as a whole as white people, but that's also not true. Like Scandinavian people have fairly different compositions than do the rest of Europeans because they've been somewhat isolated genetically. So there's just so much stuff we don't know. So I tend to be overly safe in almost every area because of that. And also, like I mentioned, I'm getting older and I don't compete in anything. So it's not as important for me to have an advantage.
Right. No, I think that's reasonable, and that's a tangent I didn't expect to get on, but I think it's an interesting one. So getting back to the meat, I know you said at the beginning that the type of meat matters. So do you see worse effects with, say, red meat than poultry and, say, fish or ham or what have you? And what is the proposed mechanism as to the difference there?
So, looking at the three major types of meat that Americans eat, which would be, I guess, beef, chicken, fish, uh, it's interesting because if you look just at the nutrition profile, then chicken would be lackluster compared to the others. Chicken is quite high in polyunsaturated fatty acids that we don't need more of. It doesn't have a ton of micronutrients. Um, and I guess it's a good sort of vehicle for other tastes, but by itself, except for the chicken skin, it doesn't taste phenomenal. So the problem is that usually in studies they don't differentiate between specific different types of meat. So it's like fish, fish healthy, fish is heart healthy, and beef isn't. If you look at specific types of meat, then like slow cooked beef could be one of the most healthy, and not specifically maybe for cancer, but just for health in general. Because if you slow cook meat on the bone, then you get things like carnitine, various amino acids that beef is high in that other things aren't high in. If it's pastured meat, you get a decent amount of omega 3s as well. If it's meat on the bone and it's slow cooked, you can also get some semblance of joint tissue. So, instead of getting a supplement of glucosamine, chondroitin, hyaluronic acid, you can get some of that from the joint tissue from the meat that's attached to the bone. You can also get collagen. So, collagen, even though it hasn't been studied that much for joint health, is probably one of the better joint health supplements. So, beef is probably fairly good in that regard. Um, Fish is also good, but fish, I think, started the process of omega 3s being overrated, which has a net bad effect probably on health. So, in the 80s, all stemmed from that Time magazine cover of cholesterol being bad and all that, and some flawed observational studies. The story was that fat is categorically bad, and then it evolved to fat isn't categorically bad as long as it's omega 3s or omega 6s. That's okay. And even now, the American Heart Association put out a stance paper a couple years ago on, people have been wondering, are omega 6s bad? No, they're not. Evidence points to them being good. But if you look at the authors, and I feel somewhat bad saying this because one of the authors was a potential advisor of mine in my PhD program, but a lot of them have funding from Monsanto, Coca-Cola, National Cattlemen's Beef Association, that kind of thing. And it wasn't a systematic review. if you actually were to do a systematic review of omega-6s, that is, looking at every study on the health impacts of omega-6s and culling out the ones that are bad quality, you'd find that we don't need more omega-6s in our diet. There's almost no way to not get enough omega-6s. Most people, if they pay any attention to their diet, get enough omega-3s. So the end result is it allows for marketing on labels of packaged food saying, high in omega-3s or high in omega-6s. We don't need more of those. Omega-3s and 6s are very easily oxidized. The net is probably worse to have omega-3s and 6s added to your diet than saturated fats. And it also makes the analysis very simplistic. Like, oh, if I look at this label and it doesn't have any saturated fat, but it has a bunch of PUFA, then it's fine. That's not true. And that's probably one of the worst health effects because the fatty acid content is hidden. You have to put the types of carbs and how much protein on nutrition labels, but if you go out to eat, then the cheap salad dressing could be healthy, it could be unhealthy, or it could be who knows, because they don't really have to label it.
Okay, so that brings us off onto a whole another tangent again, but I do want to just pause here for a minute, I suppose. So you said that we don't need more omega-6 fatty acids in our diet because they're just ubiquitous.
Yeah.
But do you think it would be a good recommendation for cardiovascular health, if nothing else, to increase the amount of omega-3s in the diet? So not to do with the ratio of omega-3 to omega-6. So it might not necessarily be a good idea to actually decrease the omega-6. This is the recommendation I would give. You don't need to decrease your intake of omega-6s, but it's a good idea to actively increase your intake of omega-3s to a point.
So it's tough to have a factual answer to that based on studies because usually these are observational studies looking at both the omega-6-3 ratio and the absolute amounts. But the thing to keep in mind is that fatty acid turnover in the body is really slow. So, there's a pool of fatty acids maintained in adipose tissue and also in cell membranes, and it takes a long time to change your fatty acid ratios. So, the omega-6-3 ratio is fairly strongly correlated to heart health, but high levels of both omega-6s and 3s are inversely correlated to heart health. So the the devil lies in the details. How much is too high? And that's what researchers don't know. So it depends on the person. The individual person would have to get an omega-6-3 ratio test, which is I think $100. I don't remember what the test is called, but if you've been eating a standard American diet for years, then you almost definitely have too much fatty acids, omega-6s, possibly 3s. If you're eating a really, really terrible diet, you might not have enough omega-3s. But if you've been eating a somewhat terrible diet, you probably incidentally get enough omega-3s anyway and just have a ton of omega-6s. So omega-3s, it's really complicated. So like the New York Times last year wrote a piece about are omega-3s good for heart health or not? And they wanted to see what the entire body of evidence said. So they asked us, can you summarize it? And it ended up being a much longer conversation than either of us thought we were in for because there's some medications, you've probably heard of Lovaza, the omega-3 pill made by Pfizer, I think, that have studies behind them. But the studies are for intermediate outcomes, not for actually heart disease or death from heart attacks. And it's really only somewhat high levels of EPA, not EPA and DHA or DHA alone. Somewhat high levels of EPA that are more correlated with heart health. So taking that into consideration, there's only one trial right now on the new EPA-only omega-3 prescription drug that seems to be having some pretty good results. And the rest of this stuff is mostly actually junk. So the huge body of omega-3 and heart health evidence is mostly for intermediate outcomes, and it doesn't appear that boosting your omega-3 levels beyond a minimal amount helps heart health. So the question is why? It could be one of several things. It could be that having too much omega-3s is bad because they're easily oxidized. It could be that in the context of a typical American's lifestyle and diet, it's not great to have too much omega-3s and 6s. And that could be because we're not getting other nutrients that are needed, like, vitamin E is needed to prevent long chain polyunsaturated acids from being oxidized. It's kind of hard to know. So I'd say that like 4 or 5 years ago, I saw a couple fairly popular gurus on the internet with calculators for omega 3s, and you would put in your age and your goals and stuff, and it would spit out how many omega 3 pills you're supposed to take a day. And I put mine in, and I was supposed to take something like 15 to 20 grams a day, which is nuts. So first of all, this only pertains to me, but I bleed fairly easily. I don't clot that quickly. It's not that pathological, but it wouldn't be great. So I wouldn't want to have that much omega 3 in my system, even though there's not a strong link between high omega 3s and bleeding. You want to make sure, damn sure, that you don't bleed easily and you clot fairly well, because the brain and heart depend on that. But beside that, um, you could potentially feel better sooner if you take a bunch of omega 3s for inflammation and stuff, but it's not a wise move. Basically, if you supplement omega 3s, you'll probably never know if they're helping. So omega 3s might be the one of the biggest supplement categories, but it's not one of the ones that I think you should get into before some of the more basic ones.
Interesting. So my typical recommendation is to, I always say to max out your whole food route first. So I recommend 2 to 4 servings of fatty fish per week, and with that, you probably don't need any fish oil supplementation. If you're not getting that, then I would say, as a assertive recommendation, 3 grams combined EPA DHA per day. I think that's an old Alan Aragon recommendation. Do you think that that's reasonable, or what are your thoughts on that? Because you seem to be like surprisingly unconvinced on the research on omega 3s, insofar as they are cardioprotective and so on.
Yeah, I'd say that that's a fairly conservative recommendation. It's unlikely to do much harm. It depends on the person. So if somebody is eating a decent amount of pastured beef or pastured eggs or something, they'll get enough omega 3. The problem is that most people in the US either don't have access to those foods, or those foods are really expensive, or they can't differentiate between pastured and cage-free and organic and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that's pretty safe. But with the caveat being that, like at my old job, it was at an evidence-based practice center. There's 12 or 13 of those in the country, and the U.S. federal government, when they need to do an evidence review of something big, then they hire one of those centers. So, like, what age should women get mammograms routinely? When should men with prostate cancer seek treatment versus not? The first project I got hired for back in the day was a year or two before the vitamin D guidelines came out. We got hired to synthesize all the evidence for that. So before I had come on board, they had just finished the omega 3 report. And it was super long and boring because there's so many studies on omega 3, and no one person could read all of them. But what I got from skimming the most important results were, there's a stark contrast in the studies that, when there are studies that show borderline significance for omega 3s being bad, which is not that many of them, it's always with supplementation. It's never with fish. And I don't know why that is. It could be that, I mean, these weren't observational studies. This wasn't looking at people who eat a lot of fish, because those people probably are healthier. This was randomizing people to supplementing with fish oil, eating more fish, or nothing. And in those very few studies like that, eating fish is better than the fish oil. And you might wonder why that is, because fish doesn't have a ton of micronutrients. It's mostly the fish oil that's going to be the bioactive in there. So just based on those few studies, I'd say, if at all possible, eat fish. If not, take fish oil, see if that helps not your total cholesterol, but your more specific, like particle count and those kinds of things. But really just try to, err on the whole food side, because fish oil, almost 99% sure, is unlikely to be bad. But most of the evidence is observational and not that great in quality. So I am a little bit of a downer on the fish oil supplementation front.
Right. And I just want to quickly circle back to the whole processed meat thing, which is where we started. So as you probably know, the World Health Organization put out this claim saying that eating 50 grams of meat per day can increase your risk for colorectal cancer by 18%. So based on that recommendation, I personally know a lot of people who've started avoiding processed meat. And I think that is a good teaching point, or at least one that I've used to explain the difference between an absolute risk and a relative risk. So a lot of people will hear an increase in risk of 18% and assume that that increases your risk from the baseline, which is only 5%. So like when you consider all of the epidemiological factors, your risk of developing colorectal cancer is basically 5%. So it's increased. There's an increase of 18%. A lot of people think that now that means you have a 23% chance of getting it, but it's an 18% chance. It's an increase of 18%. So it really goes from like 5% to 5% plus 18% of 5, which is like 5.9%. So the difference is actually like less than 1% when looked at on an absolute scale, right? So I think that when you just understand the statistics behind it, it really just lessens the amount of fear that you might feel as a result of the headlines or what have you.
And then when you actually read the studies, so I mean, it was obviously a very legitimate report by a lot of really smart scientists, but if you look at the actual studies, this came up before. To look at colorectal cancer risk from eating meat, it's not going to be randomized trials. 99% of the evidence. So people who eat, I mean, it sounds so simplistic, but people that eat processed meats, what are the chances that they're eating something else that is not as healthy as people who aren't eating processed meat? So, I don't know how much they accounted for controlling for confounding factors in the World Health Organization study, but if you do eat processed meat, and you're somebody listening to this podcast, you're unlikely to eat very cheap processed meats in high amounts every single day. So the actual relative risk of eating processed meats on an even semi-regular basis is almost sure to be below that. It might be like an additional 5 to 10% risk or something, because your gut then is just not subject to those processed meats and their byproducts very often. It's all, it's one of the coolest abstract things I think of sometimes is how physiology, whether it's things in the gut, things that you can see, food breaking down, or things in the cell bumping into each other, or even atoms, they all kind of run by the same principles. So, like what are the chances that heterocyclic amine from processed meats is going to bump into the polyp that is precancerous in your intestine? Well, it depends on, are you constipated? Is your motility low? Is there other stuff in your food? And then in your cell, like what are the chances something is going to affect your DNA? Well, how much is in there? How much other stuff is going to bump against it? What's promoting it in the cell membrane? It's all very similar stuff with completely different and unrelated compounds, but it's all a probability game. And that's why relative risk is so important, because it's tiny probabilities added up over time. It's never one simplistic thing.
Right. And I think that's a good point, because I think that when you include vegetables and high fiber foods along with processed meat, so if you have a diet that's high in plants and fiber, then that tends to negate some of the negative effects of red meat. Is that true?
Yeah, and this is one area where scientists actually pretty precisely know foods that you should try to eat if you're specifically trying to reduce the risk from this. So broccoli, Brussels sprouts, that kind of thing, cruciferous veggies have compounds that reduce the impact of some of these metabolites from cooked meat. So it's basically, if you eat healthy foods along with your somewhat unhealthy foods, there's a fairly good chance they'll reduce either the levels of these metabolites or oxidation, or even the amount of iron from binding iron. And it's things like I said, cruciferous veggies, but even spices and herbs. And it makes so much elegant sense that humans have evolved to eat a mix of foods. And processed meats aren't inherently unhealthy, because, cavemen they also smoked their meats to keep them um, from getting bacteria in them. And you always have a mix of things that seem to be healthy and seem to be unhealthy. So nothing is inherently unhealthy. Water, you know, meat, protein, all these things, it just depends on how your body reacts.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that like this conversation overall is just flavored by a ton of confounding factors? So like it seems to be the case that people who tend to eat more red meat are also more likely to be inactive, are more likely to eat more calories overall, more likely to smoke, and all of these other things. So do you think that that sort of muddies the conversation to the point that it's like really kind of hard to extrapolate these sort of recommendations to, like, say, avoid red meat or what have you to people who are healthy and active and aren't otherwise unhealthy?
Yeah, you simply cannot tease apart these factors, and it can get super complicated, like over my head. So, somebody who eats a lot of meat, um, it could be that they're eating less vegetables. Their gut lining is a little more inflamed. Inflamed gut lining might not release compounds that metabolize things like histamine. So, histamine is responsible for allergic reactions. And some people, when they eat certain foods, they break out in hives. And there sometimes appears to be no rhyme or reason to that, but sometimes it's that either those foods have high levels of the amino acid histamine, or that for that period of time, your gut lining, because it was injured, is not producing compounds that break down histamine in foods. So maybe because of that, you have a lot of histamine floating around in your gut. And then with all that histamine, it makes the environment ripe for uh, for tumorigenesis. So it's a very roundabout way of increasing processed meat, leading to higher risk for colorectal cancer. That has almost nothing to do with even the things I mentioned, iron and whatnot. It's just a very roundabout way. So it's easy for researchers to pretend that they know what they're talking about, especially for media or Facebook people to pretend like something is a culprit, but we don't know.
Right.
There's so many, there's like dozens or hundreds of factors, and it's just cool to know all the things that you don't know about.
Right. So, in terms of for our listeners who might just want the practical takeaway, what would you say for processed meat and red meat as a guideline or a general rule for people when they're making dietary decisions?
So, whatever the definition of occasional is to somebody, I'd say stick to occasional for processed meats, and even that as a disclaimer, which is the like the hot dogs that are at my local Whole Foods, Applegate or whatever. Those are processed, but they're not processed that much, and I think they're even pastured. So like that's going to be nothing compared to the cheapo hot dogs. And like I remember when I was in college with no money and living with like five people during the summer, this guy bought a combination pack of hot dogs and chitlins. Um, Chitlins are what, the intestine of a cow or something. Um, and it was something like 99 cents a pound. So that was a while ago, but on that end of the continuum, if you're gonna eat stuff like that, make occasional once a month or something like that. Um, and the thing is, once you get in the habit of just being aware that these things are probably not great for you, you don't even have to think about amounts that often. You just get in the habit of erring on the side of eating the thing that's not as processed. So I don't think the level of process has much to do with it. It's just, if I were to give a recommendation, then eat meat as much as you want. Eat processed meat on a special occasion or when you feel like it, or if you're stressed out or whatever. Just don't make a habit of it.
Right. Um, okay, awesome. So I was hoping we could talk about saturated fat for a little bit,
Okay.
because that's one that's been ostracized by health organizations and the media for a long time. So, do you think that we should be avoiding saturated fat? I'm sure it depends, but
Um, this one is, I'd say, actually less depends. For most people, I'd say they don't have to avoid saturated fat. Um, for people who have heart disease, who don't eat healthy diets, who have familial hypercholesterolemia, those types of people, I'd say avoid saturated fat. But for other people, take a cue from what our adipose tissue stores naturally are, which I can't specifically remember, but it's fairly spread out amongst monounsaturated and saturated fats with a sprinkling of polyunsaturated fats. So let's say it's something like 50% monounsaturated, 30% saturated, 20% polyunsaturated. It's definitely less polyunsaturated than that. But for a normal human, from like 50 or 100 years ago, that's what their adipose tissue would be made of. Breast milk has a certain ratio of mono, and saturated fats. Even animals or food from animals like butter. Butter isn't all saturated fat. So there's always a balance of saturated fats. And without thinking too hard about it, that probably indicates that we should eat a balance of fats. So don't stay away from saturated fats. Saturated fats are the most stable fatty acid. They're not inherently bad. There's different types of saturated fatty acids. Typically, the longer chains tend to be more implicated in heart disease than the shorter chains. But even there's some variation. So more so, probably think about it in terms of foods. So what types of foods are quote unquote natural? If coconut and coconut oil is not a panacea. I don't know how it got to this point where it cures cancer and autoimmune disease and makes your skin shiny,
And
but
HIV.
and HIV. Yeah, if the 80s had coconut oil, we wouldn't have any HIV. But uh, coconut oil might not be the greatest thing ever, but coconut oil in almost every well-controlled, high-quality randomized trial does fairly well or neutral for heart health. Um, the arguments are almost always observational or in vitro. So, like coconut, if you think conceptually, let's say you're just trying to get your own food. It's hard for people to think of because you usually go hunting in your supermarket. But let's say you're going to get your own food, or think about watching a survival show. So my girlfriend and I are addicted to stupid survival shows. Naked and Afraid was the other one. I don't remember, but so in those shows, they're put in a variety of different climates and they have to get food. So coconut is often one of the foods that's there, coconut or banana or something like that. How many plants have fat? Coconut, avocado, olive, really not that many. So these are special plants because if you find something like those plants, it means you have a concentrated energy source. And you got lucky because there's not a lot of other plants that have that much fat. And if you eat that fat, you can store that fat for use later as energy. So um, if you compare those, olive, avocado, and coconut, to something like a sunflower or rapeseed, which is the source for a canola oil, you can't squeeze fat out of rapeseed or sunflower. Those you don't pick one of those up and then like put it in your teeth and squeeze out the fat. You have to put it in a hexane bath, chemically get out the fat, maybe deodorize it, make sure it doesn't go rancid because it has a lot of polyunsaturated fatty acids. So rather than thinking about how much saturated fat should I eat, think about which foods do I eat that have fat that just seems to naturally occur in the plant versus things that you have to, squeeze the hell out of with chemical means to get fat. And if you err on the former fats, you're probably getting fairly healthy fats because in order to get fat from like canola, you have to do stuff to it. Not that preservation is bad or chemicals are bad, they're not. It's just that basing your diet on foods that you have to squeeze the nutrients out of, probably not wise. So coconut has a lot of saturated fat. Um, Olives don't. They have monounsaturated fat. Avocados have a ton of monounsaturated fat. And if you combine those with animal fats, you'll get a pretty good sprinkling of different fatty acids, and you'll most likely be okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I think that's reasonable. And the one that we didn't cover, so we did saturated fats, PUFAs or polyunsaturated fats, monounsaturated fats. Well, omega 3's and 6's would fall under the poly. We didn't touch on trans fats.
Yeah.
So maybe we can talk about those for a minute.
So the only artificial trans fat issue right now, ever since 5, 10 years ago, when trans fat started to be reduced in the food supply, is occasionally there's lower levels of trans fat that don't have to be labeled. I think this is still the case because if you have less than like zero point 0.5 grams, then it's rounded down to zero. Maybe that's changed in the past couple of years, but even then, I don't think that's enough trans fat to cause a huge issue. More so, the controversy, very low level controversy right now, is natural trans fats. So the thinking was always that natural trans fats are healthy, um, like the fats you get from ruminant animals, from cows, and that kind of stuff. And they are linked to improved cardiovascular parameters. But even just a few months ago, there was a study looking at ruminant trans fats that found that they're actually, in a certain scenario, linked to slightly increased LDL and some other possibly bad parameters. So I'm not totally convinced by that. We did cover it in the Examine Research Digest, but the natural trans fats that you're getting along with all your other fats are far, far outweighed by the other fatty acids you're getting. So trans fats for most people is not really something to think about nowadays. Um, the other type of fat that does come up is shorter chain, medium chain fatty acids, and that's something that could be therapeutic, not just for things like epilepsy, which they're used for clinically, but possibly other maybe mood-related disorders and some other very interesting disorders that I haven't read a ton about. And This is one of the first things that I looked into before I was even interested in nutrition or bodybuilding or powerlifting, based on the movie Lorenzo's Oil that I saw when I was a kid, where this kid, I presume his name is Lorenzo, I'm not sure, his parents are worried because he has a really bad metabolic condition and he's probably going to die within the next few months. And the doctors can't help him. And they're like, well, just spend time with your kid now. So they go to the library, they do a ton of research, they find a combination of fatty acids that helps their son, and their son lives longer in the movie. I think in real life he didn't. But it's helped a lot of other kids. And um, it's cool because when you think about it, that's a true story. Fat is the most underappreciated macronutrient, especially bodybuilders. It's protein number one, carbs number two. You elevate or reduce based on if you're bulking or cutting, and then your allowance is fat, the rest of it. But maybe that should be flipped because if you're a somewhat in the know bodybuilder, you'll get enough protein. Um, and carbs, that just comes along with your food and it's fun to eat. It's the fat and the fat type that is so interesting. And there hasn't been that many studies on type of fat and muscle gain, but as they emerge, we try to look into each one because arachidonic acid has been investigated as a potential muscle building aid. So, it's often seen as something that's inflammatory, but if you take it every day in certain amounts, it could even be something that helps muscle growth. So fatty acids are complicated. They haven't been looked into much for non-cardiovascular things, but I think that's one of the coolest areas of research.
Yeah, I'm aware of at least one study that's shown a positive effect of omega-3 supplementation on lean body mass. I don't know if you've seen that, so that's fairly interesting too. So I guess I probably should have done this at the beginning of the fat discussion, but I guess for any listeners who aren't familiar with the terms, the best thing to do at this point would be to probably Google them to look for the structural differences, because in terms of like practical significance, I think we've pretty much covered more or less everything. Another thing that comes up in bodybuilding circles to do with fat intake is its effect on testosterone production.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a big concern, I don't know if it's warranted or not, that if one drops their fat intake too low, then their testosterone will suffer. Do you think that there's any sort of case that can be made for keeping fat intake high on a cut, so as to sort of max out your testosterone levels?
So it's a balance on a cut. I mean, on a bulk, who cares? Not who cares, but you don't care as much. On a cut, it's tough because there have been how many? There's been like four higher quality studies on testosterone and fat intake, and there's some connection to saturated fat and a stronger connection to overall fat intake. So that being said, it depends on a cut how much fat you're willing to eat. So you know better than I do how every gram counts in bodybuilding, and if you're getting an extra 10 to 20 grams of fat, then that's a substantial number of calories compounded over the course of days. Uh, so definitely get whatever enough fat is. So don't shun fat. But nobody knows what the specific fat intake is that'll support testosterone production enough. So, it'll be a curve of some sort, with the asymptote and then an inflection point or whatever it's called somewhere where the additional gram of fat isn't worth it in terms of the calories you'd gain. And I don't know what that level is, but it's definitely not like 5 or 10 grams. It's more than that. And it's definitely less than like 50 grams. You definitely don't have to eat 50 grams of fat to produce enough testosterone. But I don't know what the specific number is.
Yeah, I usually set the low ball at like 30 or 35, but it'll
Yeah,
depend on the
that's
body weight of the person, and that's usually towards like the very, very end of a cut. Very, very rarely do I go lower than that. And if I do, I always emphasize the importance of getting the essential fatty acids in the diet, since I feel as though those could be displaced, especially if the diet is a long one.
yeah.
Yeah. The last thing I just wanted to say on this topic, and then we'll move on, is just to comment on something you said about trans fats. So I think that you said that in our current culture, trans fats aren't really so much an issue. I think I might disagree, just based on the fact that people are eating so much baked goods and
Yeah.
things like that, and I just feel like it would just be such a simple recommendation. Like, you don't need to look at trans fats as a percentage of your total fat intake like the recommendations are set up now. You can sort of just say, you know what, you should avoid foods that are high in processed trans fat, so like baked goods, donuts, like hard stick margarine, and that sort of stuff. And if you do that,
Yeah,
then you're probably okay, right?
that's right. I probably should have specified I more so meant the podcast audience
Oh,
who
right, okay.
it's fairly, I think, fairly well educated. But
Yeah.
for everybody, there's no physiological need to eat trans fats. So might as well stay away from baked goods that have it listed, because if you have trans fat in a baked good, it means it's probably not even that high quality of a baked good. And even like, so things like baked goods, they vary a lot in how healthy or unhealthy they can be. So it's never going to be super healthy. But if you use, so this is a tough one because I don't know if you're gluten sensitive or if you have family that have celiac or
I don't personally, but
anything, but
if
it comes up
if
a
we had a
lot.
hundred people here, someone would.
Yeah, somebody, one or two people would. The reason it's a huge issue is because, so in the American food supply, I don't remember what the stat is, but if you combine wheat, um, soybean oil, and table sugar, you get something like over 50% of our calories, which is nuts, and a lot of that is baked good and or baked, fried snack or whatever. So then issues start being conflated. Like when people look at the totality of public health, then it's like, well, what is it in the baked good? Is it that it has sugar? Is that it has fat? Is it the combination of those? Most likely it's just that eating stuff like that displaces stuff that's good. But the other thing is, this comes up almost never. When you eat something like, a lot of Ritz crackers, and peanut butter, which is a really good combination, especially if you have grape jelly. But if you eat a lot of that, it's filling, but it's extra filling because those foods are acellular. When you eat a food that is living, no, that's a terrible term to use because then raw foodists will think I'm supporting them. If you eat a food that has cells, whatever food that is, spinach, whatever, buckwheat, then that's like almost a better term to use than unprocessed, because there's a cellular structure to those foods. It hasn't been broken down by grinding it until it's a fine powder. So it turns out that that's probably a fairly important thing independently for health, because if you eat acellular foods, so a lot of flour and a lot of table sugar, then you have to consider what happens in the digestive system. So that stuff goes down, is super easily processed, is easily accessible to everything, including bacteria, and then it does not gel. It doesn't form clumps. It doesn't make passing stool easy. And it has very different effects on gut bacteria than almost any cellular food would have. And that's aside from energy density. So when I give recommendations about fat or types of foods, or when people say, "Oh, my cousin's cousin is gluten sensitive," then I try to get away from gluten in general because it is true that most people have at least some tiny effect from gluten in the intestine, but it's probably a bit overblown amongst people who are really into gluten avoidance, but underblown, if that's a word, for people in general, because it is an issue if you eat a lot of gluten every day. Like you were saying, relative risk, it might increase your risk for certain diseases by like 5% over the baseline risk. So it might not be huge as an independent factor, but when you combine it with acellular foods, it's huge trouble. And through various mechanisms, I think it probably contributes a lot to two chronic conditions or groups of conditions that are prevalent now, which is depression and autoimmune disease. Depression, because there's a strong link between what goes on in our gut and what goes on in our brain through both the immune system, endocrine system, and direct nervous system connections. And autoimmune conditions, because a lot of autoimmune disease starts in the gut and how healthy your gut lining is. And if you have a family history of things like autoimmune disease, then you don't maybe even need to wait around to see if you have celiac. It's probably better in general to avoid gluten, even though it seems alarmist, it probably is.
Oh wow, that's interesting. Um, so I think I'll leave that there for all the food stuff. Actually, before we move on to the supplement stuff, I did want to touch on aspartame. So how about we'll do that? Let's quickly talk about aspartame and whether it's something we need to be concerned about.
So, artificial sweeteners are more so than almost anything else, something that has a ton of studies that don't give a strong conclusion. And it's because they're toxicological studies. So these aren't studies that give a group aspartame and another group placebo and follow them over the course of time and see what happens. These are 90% animal studies. The studies that aren't animal studies, they're just kind of clues. Like, for example, there was the study last year that showed that aspartame can negatively affect the gut microbiome. It actually wasn't a very well done study, but that being said, it probably still can negatively affect the gut microbiome. So the issue is that um, it probably doesn't matter for people who use some aspartame occasionally, even like a couple times a week. But I'm sure you know people who drink either a certain soda or eat something with a certain sweetener every day, their whole life, right? And I've had roommates who drink, Diet Coke or Coke Zero every single day. And then they eat a healthy diet other than that. And I don't blame them because artificially sweetened beverages are actually a great way to lose weight. Because if you need some reward in your brain in order to continue on a diet, where are you going to get that reward? It's either you get it from food, cocaine, there's not that many things that cause that dopamine rush. So, okay, artificial sweeteners, okay. But if you are hooked on an artificial sweetener or artificially sweetened beverage, then there's probably some problems. And it almost doesn't matter what the evidence says because if a rat has a higher chance of pancreatic cancer after having a high aspartame intake, even if it's 10 times higher than what humans would eat, we have no idea how it applies to humans because rats are very similar to humans in ways that matter, but rats are in a highly controlled situation. They have stress from the lab, but they don't have stress from social interaction and jobs and stuff like we do. They may have similar physiology, but they don't have a history of eating varied diets and having crazy complex gut microbiomes like we do. So I don't think scientists really know. And if a scientist ever says aspartame does or doesn't cause some type of cancer, then don't believe them. It's really like it's not even that there's a 5% higher risk of a certain condition. It's that there's a 20% chance that we know that there's a 5% higher chance of a certain condition. So, how risk tolerant are you as a person? So, as long as the person knows about that and can make their own decision, then that's fine. People who are risk intolerant, might not drink it, or people who are risk tolerant or just have other priorities in life, drink your diet soda. It's not the end of the world. There's more important things. It's more important to lose weight than to not drink diet soda.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And I think I'm noticing something with you, Kamal, is that you seem like you tend to err on the side of safety. It's like better be safe than sorry with these sort of things because we
Yeah,
just
there's
don't have
actually
the conclusive answers, right?
sometimes I think about like I changed on this kind of every couple of years. Sometimes I try to be more authoritative to express authority. And then sometimes I'm like, I don't, there's a lot of stuff I don't know. And there was a podcast from last year where um, it was so crazy. Like half the people were like, "Oh, that's a great podcast, and a lot of cool things came up." And then there were people who were like, "This guy's just like hemming and hawing, and he doesn't know what he's talking about." And like, one person was like, "If you don't think gluten's bad for you, then like read the studies." And another person's like, take your your vegan alarmism elsewhere. And I didn't say either of those things, but
Yeah.
there is a quote on the wall of the library I used to go to at the Tufts Medical School, and it was from one of the first physicians, Maimonides, I think, and it said, "Teach thy tongue to say I do not know, and thou shalt prosper." And I wish people did that more because if you're a guru, then it hurts you to express doubt, but it's true.
Hmm.
Who knows? One person can only read so many studies, so I
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I guess what I would say there is like you have, I think it's like over 90 different countries who all of their regulatory bodies have decided that aspartame is safe at such and such a dose, something like 50 milligrams per kilogram or something. Um, if you actually like do that out in terms of cans of soda, it's like 21 cans of soda a day
Yeah.
for like the rest of your life. So it's like if all of these different bodies have independently came to this exact same result, then I feel as though maybe you're being like a little bit too conservative with the like one can of diet pop per day. Like I would think that that would be way conservative. Is definitely safe.
Well, I don't know much about Diet Pop, so let me ask you this. What does Diet Coke have? Is that aspartame or is it?
That's actually a good question. I know that it used to be aspartame in the States, but I heard as of last year they switched it just because so many people were becoming fearful of consuming
Okay.
aspartame that I think they switched it to sucralose in the U.S. But in Canada, it is sucralose or Splenda.
Okay,
Yeah,
so basically
I'm
my
fairly
thinking.
confident. But there's another one too. The potassium.
Oh yeah, Ace K.
Yeah,
Yeah.
S-sulfame potassium. Yeah.
So my thinking is that, and because I'm not a diet soda drinker, I might be not connecting to diet soda drinkers, but there's different diet sodas that have different sweeteners. And if I were to choose an artificial sweetener, I would choose Splenda
Mm.
because it has the most research out of any artificial sweetener, I think. And it's probably the least likely to be harmful, even out of all the very low risks of harm. So if I had to choose something, I would just choose one that didn't have aspartame. So not necessarily because aspartame is going to kill you, but because there's options that taste similar. But I know that there's people who are like, I would only drink Diet Coke because the other ones taste like shit. So who knows? I mean, I don't really know.
Fair enough. I guess like what is your reason for having pause with aspartame though? Like I mean because like it seems to me like you could just say that about absolutely anything. Like you could be like, I don't know, like what's something that's like not well studied, like eating kiwis or like taking like I don't know, like eating a lot of sugar free or eating a lot of
Yeah.
popsicles or something, like just something random. And you could say, well, this isn't really well studied, so we should be careful about eating popsicles. It's like, well, if there's no good reason to be fearful of it, then
Okay.
maybe we shouldn't be, right?
So I'd say that the concern comes from not the evidence showing that aspartame is or isn't dangerous for certain things, but rather the decision-making process of the person who's drinking the beverage. So
Mm.
if they're drinking the aspartame beverage because they like it a lot and it helps them with something concrete like losing weight, or they're in a funk and they need something that tastes good or else they're going to be more depressed or something, then whatever. I mean, there's very little risk that we know of aspartame causing harm. But if the person is drinking the aspartame beverage out of habit and just hasn't thought about it, then I'd say that probably the precautionary principle is warranted because there are some things that aren't studyable in humans for the effects that we're concerned about, and that just happens to apply to the two biggest conditions out there, cancer and heart disease. So because we can't ever do trials of any food or additive or beverage or anything in a randomized fashion in humans to see what develops in the future, I'm unnecessarily cautious about anything that, the GRAS, generally recognized as safe
Hmm.
term. Like it's actually a bit inaccurate because those are just things that have been grandfathered in from years ago. But there are things that are generally recognized as safe that humans eat, and that's like food and beverages and stuff. So like it even though it would appear that the risk of eating processed meats is fairly high for causing colorectal cancer, compared to something like aspartame being linked to any cancer, I would say it's rather that we don't know for either one. And for aspartame, it's going to be very difficult to do a trial like that because at this point, nobody's ever going to fund a study to feed people aspartame for 2 years.
Hmm.
They would deem it to be unethical, even though it's not really. So I don't think it's probably not going to hurt anybody, but unless something has a use for weight loss or for whatever, I'd say it's not a habit that is necessary.
Right.
So less definite harm than lack of benefit.
Right, right. I understand. I guess what I would say, though, is like in the case of saturated fats, for example, we at least have some sort of mechanism that might imply that it could be negative for health outcomes, right? So saturated fats increase risk of atherosclerosis as a result of them hardening on arterial
Yeah.
walls and so on. With aspartame, I'm not aware of even any mechanism, so it seems like any sort of extra precaution would just be unwarranted in its absence. Now, I know a lot of people point to formaldehyde, right, as a concern there. But what would be your concern? Is it the rat research that's shown links to cancer and so on?
So it would be less that stuff than the formative research which might not continue now that aspartame isn't as popular.
Right.
Like for example, in the study last year that I mentioned, I can't remember all the details. So aspartame was tested in rats. Um, Totally not applicable study because it was tested in rats that don't have a microbiome. So if you test something in a lack of a microbiome, you're going to have different results than you would in a human. But they did also test aspartame in a very small sample of humans, either 4 or 7, and it substantially changed their gut microbiomes.
Mm.
So the thinking is this: if you rewind to 2 years to 2014, we didn't know that that was even a possibility.
Right.
So basically, the stupid answer is I don't know why,
Yeah.
I don't, and I'm comfortable not knowing why because of the lack of need for aspartame. But I'm also comfortable if somebody came up to me and said, "Oh, do I need to stop drinking this?" Saying like, "No, that's not your number one concern. Your number one concern is losing weight, not eating junk food. Trans fats are a much bigger issue than not drinking aspartame. But if you get down to it, maybe aspartame would be an issue."
Right, right. Okay, I think I'm willing to agree to disagree. I mean, like the way that you frame it is like that shouldn't be your number one issue. It's like, okay, maybe I would say to them, maybe your number one issue should be like caloric restriction or what have you. But like I think that, or exercising probably would be if there's someone who's unhealthy. But I would just say that aspartame for unless you're someone who's just like abusing it is just a non-issue. So it shouldn't even really be on the table.
Yeah, for most people,
But
I'd say totally a non-issue.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But I can actually understand that you seem to be a little bit more savvy to the digestive research and the microbiome research than I am, and that's very cutting edge. So maybe you're like anticipating that if more trials come out about this, it might show that there is some interaction in the gut that could have some effects, that we
Yeah,
don't
and
know
I'm
about.
also a bit wary. I'm more critical of trials in general, whether it's human or animal, just because before I really started reading the full text of most papers I run across, when I would see study says something, then that was it. Study says something. But now, because of my job, I have to read the full text and tear apart the papers and say why they might be wrong. And more than half of papers have huge methodological concerns. So, like that gut one with aspartame, it was I guess, against aspartame, but that one had huge gaps. The pro aspartame ones have huge gaps as well. So basically, all research has gaps, and the researchers conclude two things: more research is necessary. More research is always
Yeah.
necessary, and the study was too small to look at a certain outcome.
Yeah.
So when you look at multiple outcomes, then A, you have to correct for looking at multiple outcomes because, if you look at 20 outcomes, chances are two of them will find significance. And then B, the studies are never powered for all the outcomes. So even if you're powered to find an outcome for like colorectal cancer, you might not be powered to find some other outcome. So because studies are not as straightforward or great as most people think, I put less weight on studies and more on just not even just aspartame. I don't think it's super wise to eat the same exact thing every day. And there's no good reason other than I've just seen so many papers that like 10 years later there's a paper that does a better job of it and finds
Right.
the opposite. So in absence of awesome research and billions or trillions of more dollars put into research, um, like it's not obviously not bad to eat the same thing every day, as in like it's going to increase your risk of cancer 20%. It just means that like we have a pharmacologist and a toxicologist who looks over all our study teardowns. And one thing that they would remind me all the time is, this study sucks, but this study applies to like the 10 people in the world who eat zucchini every day. And you might not think about it, but there are people like that. So there's like, kombucha, for example. Some people see it as in the same category as bone broth and coconut oil that's going to solve all your ills. But um, like kombucha could be healthy, but there's some people who drink kombucha every day where it's turned out to be unhealthy for them and sent them to the hospital. There's people who drink too much water. It's just the dose builds up over time.
Hmm.
And that's why I know what I said about protein is maybe overly alarmist, but it's the same thing over time that is not mimicked in studies because
Right.
nobody ever researches the same thing over years.
Right, right. I mean, I personally think that the recommendation to vary your food sources from day to day or week to week or whatever is a good idea, but I would say it from a stance of just being able to get more nutrients in. So, like from more
Yeah, that's the
diverse
number one
sources,
thing.
but not from a position of like avoiding your probability to build up toxins over time or cause something to have a chronic effect. Just because it does sound a little bit like fear mongering to me. It's
Oh yeah, I mean it almost literally is because it's not based on studies. It's purposefully not based on
Yeah, and
studies.
like
So
you're a smart guy, so you get away with it. But I mean, like if I if I had someone who say was I don't know, saying that like all processed foods need to be avoided because there are chemicals in them that we can't pronounce and they can build up over time, they would just be wrote off as a quack, right? But I think that you're a more reasonable person and you're more so saying like we maybe shouldn't be so trusting in the research for guiding our decisions and maybe just be a little bit more careful when it comes to our food choices.
yeah, and it's again one of the things that varies between the people listening to the podcast and the general population. So if I was like a public health czar for the government, I wouldn't say, "Oh, avoid eating the same thing every day," because it's actually good to eat the same healthy stuff every day.
Yeah, in terms of
That
habit
builds
formation.
good
Yeah.
habits, and it's awesome. And you can make sure you get all your micronutrients and lots of good benefits. But if you already got that taken care of,
Yeah.
then some people are like, "Now I have the stuff I eat, and I'm all set." I don't know. It's probably not. You're probably not all set, and that's when it's good to look into the things you're eating. Um, and I don't. It's like the 50th most important thing about nutrition,
Yeah,
so it's
yeah,
definitely
yeah.
not even in the top 10.
That's
And it
awesome.
can't be answered by studies, so it's either you do it or you don't.
Yeah, that's awesome. I really appreciate your perspective on that, Kamal. It's cool. If I had to be honest, I didn't expect that just based on like that there seems to be like a general trend in the science-based community towards like if it fits your macros and this sort of thing where it's like what in moderation like everything is fine and there's no concern for any number of different things that could potentially be harmful or could have some sort of health effect over time. So I think that that's a unique perspective, at least to the current environment of this community, I think.
Yeah.
So with that, I guess maybe we'll take a quick break, and then when we come back, we'll take a couple questions from Instagram. I posted on my Instagram that I'd be interviewing you, so I've got some supplement-related questions for you there, and then we'll get into just some general supplementation stuff. So guys, that is actually going to conclude the first part of my interview with Kamal. We ended up talking about a whole bunch of stuff that we hadn't planned for, but I think it was best that way. We got into a whole lot of details that I know I certainly enjoyed talking about, and I think that Kamal did a great job of broadening the scope of our discussion. So what I'll do is I'll conclude part one of the interview here, and we'll continue next week with part two, where we go into a whole bunch of detail about all sorts of supplementation, from things just for general health to sleep, muscle building, and I also take a handful of questions from my Instagram and Facebook. So guys, that is going to conclude this episode, and I should say the last episode of the Ice Cream for PR's podcast, at least under this name. So thank you guys so much for listening. If you're listening on iTunes or Stitcher, don't forget to subscribe. If you're listening on iTunes, please do leave me a rating, and if you feel up to it, also a review. That is actually very helpful for me. And if you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video if you enjoyed it. Leave any comments that you might have for me, and if you think other people might benefit from this conversation, then you're more than welcome to share it. And that's always very much appreciated. Okay, guys, thank you so much for listening. I'll see you in the next episode.
Here are the headlines.